we never know how someone's going to surprise us if we just give them the chance.
Help me welcome Joe Hirsch.
Hey, everybody. I hope you are doing well and staying safe out there. And what a crazy time it is. And if these uncertain times have told us anything, it's that our words matter more than ever before. The problem is that the things that we say aren't usually as important as what others hear. Isn't that the case? I mean, think about the last time you had a conversation about work or performance. Did your words actually reach their full impact? I'm Joe Hirsch, and I hope today's training is going to be a different kind of virtual experience. I hope we're going to learn together today, laugh together today, and ultimately grow together today. This is a wonderful opportunity for us to revisit the way we think about our assumptions about feedback, to explore a new approach called Feedforward, and to explore together a partnership model that changes the dynamics, the tone, and even the trajectory of everyday performance conversations. But in that spirit of doing things together, I want to actually start us off with a little bit of a quiz. So go ahead and pull out your phones if you don't have them or on your desktop. And I want you to go take a quick visit over to a website called slido.com. So hit that up for me real quick and enter the code 65065. And the question I have for you guys today is, what kind of feedback chimp do you think you are? Now, today is really going to be focusing on how to give better feedback. But the reality is that the way we experience feedback ourselves is a very powerful predictor of how we help others experience it too. So the kind of feelings that we experience whenever someone asks us the question, can I give you some feedback? Oftentimes are the same kind of emotions that we are causing others to feel as well when we give them feedback. So the question for you today, to start us off and to get some collaboration going here, is what kind of feedback chimp are you? Go ahead and check out slido.com. As you're thinking about this and some of the results are popping in, a lot of you here seem like you're that first kind of feedback chimp. Couple of you split between B and C. You'll also notice that I didn't tell you what the chimps are doing. Part of this is you bringing your own understandings and your own impressions to this experience. Take another moment, think about what kind of feedback chimp you are. Again, just to bring it back there. Chimp A, chimp B, chimp C. What kind of feedback chimp are you? So bringing it back up here for you guys, most of you associated yourselves, saw yourselves with chimp A, maybe feeling a little bit nervous, anxious, perhaps experiencing feedback with a sense of dread. And the truth is, you are perfectly normal because the reality is that most people, most of the time, consider themselves to be very feedback averse. They don't like hearing it. They don't like experiencing it. And most of the time, it brings up all these dreaded feelings of anxiety, stress, of disinterest and displeasure. And the reality is that most of us, in one way or another, knowingly or unknowingly, cause others to experience the same exact kind of emotions when we give them feedback and ask the question, can I give you some feedback? And so today, what I'm hoping is that we will work on two parts to solving this feedback puzzle. Part one, we'll take a look at the fail, why feedback is failing us so much of the time. We'll take a look at some of the neuroscience, some of the brain architecture, the things that run deep inside the human mind every time we enter into these performance conversations. And then in part 2, we'll explore the fix. We'll take a look at Feedforward and its underlying strategies and science-based approaches. So let's start with the brain. Whenever someone asks you that question, can I give you some feedback? More than likely, you are probably going to experience an emotion that our ancestors felt thousands and thousands of years ago when they were sensing that their safety was somehow questioned or that their security was somehow at risk. And fight or flight, really fight, or freeze, is a very real, very visceral response that is activated whenever we sense that our surroundings are no longer safe, that our safety is somehow questioned, and that things don't seem very right. And so when someone asks that question, can I give you some feedback? More than likely, you go into one of 3 responses. Fight. You become oppositional. You become defensive. A lot of us feel that way. I definitely felt that way very early on in my career. Someone told me something about my performance, and initially I was like, that's not true. That's not me. So there was that fight response, that resistance, that refusal to see things from maybe the other person's perspective. Other people go into flight mode. They run as far away from feedback as possible. That's kind of like chimp number B, like this. Oh my God, another feedback encounter, another performance review. Some of us, though, go into freeze mode. And that's probably the worst of all, because when we enter into a state of mental paralysis, the results can be very challenging. Let me show you a picture of the human brain. This is an fMRI scan over here. No one I actually know, but it looks like he's got a pretty wicked Fu Manchu going on over there. And so here's a picture of the brain in a rest state. Okay, so probably like today, you're enjoying your lunch, you're dialing in for some afternoon learning, we're having a good time together. And the blue that you see on your screen there, that's cortisol. That's the stress-inducing hormone that is activated anytime our sense of security or safety is called into question when we go into fight or flight mode, okay? And in this instance, the cortisol levels in the brain are pretty low. This, however, is a picture of the brain that has probably just heard the question that you were asked just a moment ago, can I give you some feedback? And the feelings that that engenders, the response that provokes, it's a totally different picture. Look at the cortisol levels now. Look at how they've spiked. This is a totally different brain. This is a totally different situation. It reminds me of that PSA that ran, I think it was back in the mid 90s. I was a kid at the time. Maybe you remember it. This is your brain, showed a picture of an egg. This is your brain on drugs, showed a picture of the fried egg. Go ahead and raise your hand either virtually or using emojis, thumbs up if you remember that one as well. Yeah, so it ran for a long time. It was very successful. It did a lot of good. But when I saw it, it actually triggered a very viscerally scared response. I saw that and I freaked out. I was screaming and screaming. I saw that for the first time. I think it was on a Sunday morning. That's usually when those things ran. My mom came downstairs. She was like, Joey, what's going on? Is everything okay? I told her about what I just saw, about some guy put his brain in a frying pan, started frying his brain. And she calmed me down. She explained what it was all about. We talked about the message. And then at the end, she said to me, okay, Joey, so like, what did you learn? Because, you know, that's what moms do. They ask, what did you learn? Making sure everything is okay. And so I said to her, okay, I think I'm all right now. And I learned 2 things. Number 1, I am never, ever going to do drugs. But more importantly, I am never eating fried eggs again, ever. And that's the reality. This is your brain on feedback. Scared,
I'll probably
stressed,
eat more around 1.
shut down. This is what typically happens whenever we enter into these kinds of feedback conversations.
Oh,
If you don't mind, you guys, just muting yourselves, making sure that audio experience is optimal. That would
what
be
are you wanting though?
Thank you so much.
Along with the pictures that we'll discuss in a moment ago, those objective
Let me take a
pieces of
moment.
evidence are
We can do that PF
to
James thing.
establish
Make
what
sure
happened to
that
me before
everybody's
the
muted
accident.
there. Okay, thanks so much. Sorry about that. One of the joys of figuring out virtual presentations are those little snafus, but I think we handled that pretty well. So way to go. You will be able to chime in, and I hope you will, at various points throughout this workshop, both with each other and with me. So get ready to unmute yourselves in the right time. So this is your brain on feedback. And the truth is, it actually looks this way for a very good reason. There's 3 particular reasons why we resist most feedback. Number 1, it feels very judgmental. Now, we don't particularly like the experience of feeling judged. And most of the time, that's what feedback feels like to us on a deep neural level. It feels like we've entered into the court of public opinion, someone else's opinion, and we often don't like the verdict. It also brings about a sense of helplessness, the feeling that no matter what we do or how hard we try, nothing's ever going to change. You know, I keep hearing that same message from my boss or from my director, from my spouse, from my colleagues. They keep telling me the same thing over and over again. And it just creates a sense of learned helplessness, of not wanting to try because I don't feel like I can change my outcome, which of course is tied into fixed mindset. The belief that no matter what we do, we are limited, we are stuck in place, and that we can't ever change. But the worst, real worst reason, and the most debilitating feeling that most feedback provokes is not so much the feeling of judgment or bias or helplessness. It's that most feedback is stuck in a past that we can't control, describes events that we can no longer change. And because of that, we are literally powerless to do anything with feedback that talks about a time that we can no longer control. Now, it's not just that we can't change the past. We probably can't remember it either. Now, let me ask you guys a question here. Do you remember learning about something called the forgetting curve? Raise your hand either virtually or using your little raised hand feature or your emoji there. Do you remember anything about that? And if you want to go ahead and show your video, if you are camera ready, I'd love to see you guys now and just with a virtual wave of your hands. And let's see what's going on there. Anyone ever heard of the forgetting curve before? Either thumbs up, thumbs down. Okay, great. Okay. Well, I'm feeling that you probably did hear about it at some point. You just forgot. So let me bring that up for you and help you see what the forgetting curve looks like and why, again, it's something that can really be very debilitating in terms of human performance conversations. So the forgetting curve looks something like this. The moment we start to learn information for the very first time, we tend to remember it, but that retention rate steadily starts to drop. In fact, there's a very sudden and steep drop in memory loss within the first 24 hours of learning something. So think back to when you were a kid in elementary or middle school, maybe even high school, and teachers told you you really had to review the information that night or you would forget it. They weren't lying. Memory loss, especially within the first 24 hours, is real. And once that sudden steep fall occurs, it starts to plateau. But over the course of 7 days, just a week, most people will lose up to 90% of the information that they learned in that amount of time. And so if you think about it, things that you did just a week ago, think about a performance conversation that's taking place at the end of a quarter, at the end of a cycle, at the end of a project. Those conversations are weeks removed sometimes, at least a week from the actual event. How much of that encounter do you think your supervisor remembers? How much do you think you remember? And the reality is that most of us don't. And feedback then becomes a forensic reconstruction of the past. So we try to reassemble all the various pieces of what we think happened, at least the way we remember it. And there's a good reason why so many companies now are revisiting their performance management practices, why maybe even your organization. And we have a big range here with us today, spanning Fortune 100s all the way to small, medium-sized enterprises, to nonprofits. A lot of you coming from many different backgrounds, many different industries. And so it's interesting to think about how your own workplace has approached feedback, especially in light of the fact that there are all these strikes against it, the time lapse, the bias, the feeling that you're being judged. According to a recent survey by CEB, as many as 60% of the Fortune 500 are starting to develop new practices to work alongside existing performance management measures. And some companies famously have gone ratingless, Medtronic, Adobe, Gap. Others have gone ratingless and then come back and reached a happy medium. But some of the companies, even like Microsoft, and I think we've got someone here today from Microsoft, who pioneered that rank and yank model years ago. Stack rankings, forced rankings have started to revisit the way those procedures and processes have been done. And the reality is that the numbers tell a big story here. According to a study by Gallup about a year and a half ago, 62%, almost 2/3 of individuals who were surveyed felt that the person giving them feedback was talking about themselves in the performance conversation or prioritizing the things that they felt were important. In science, we have a name for this. It's called the idiosyncratic rater effect. Basically just means that when I'm giving you feedback, the things that I'm looking at, the things that I'm giving priority to, are the things that I care about, not necessarily you. So that's where rater bias comes in. That's where subjectivity creeps in. But even if you get past the bias and the idiosyncrasies of giving feedback, most people surveyed felt that it wasn't happening often enough. Only 20% felt that it was being shared weekly. Very often, it's happening less than that. And worst of all, of those who were surveyed, only 27% actually felt that it was helpful. So not only was it not happening very often, and not only was it tinged with bias, it didn't actually do a lot of good to help people do better. So for all these reasons, the creep of bias, the feeling that we're being judged, time lapse, the sense that we can't actually change anything. Feedback is broken. But we know that not just from numbers. Humans every day engage in these conversations, which makes feedback a very human enterprise. It affects real people every single day. Take a look at this conversation between an employer and an employee. I want you to pay attention to the assumptions that the employer, the boss, is making in this case. Pay attention to his body language. Also pay attention to the receiver, the employee. Look at how she takes the feedback that she's getting. And let's see if we can make some concrete observations about that. Because after we watch this video, we're going to break out and do some online discussion. More on that in just a bit. First, feedback gone wrong.
So I brought you in to talk about your performance. I'm not happy. Like this right now is just unprofessional. You're a visionary.
I know.
But the 3-hour naps in the middle of the day cannot continue.
I don't take naps.
You don't take naps. Okay, let's talk about your reports. Here is Bill's quarterly. This is what you give me.
That's Mommy.
Let's talk about your lunch break.
Playtime.
You know, a lot of our associates are taking working lunches, try to catch up on workload, and you're off God knows where, doing God knows what. I don't think it's working out. I think we need to say goodbye.
Bye.
No, Penny, we need to part ways at this juncture. You're fired.
Please don't fire me.
I'm sorry, Penny. You're fired.
I have to support my mom and dad.
Penny, I don't want to hear about your personal life.
I'm gonna work harder.
You've said this before.
I'm gonna work smarter.
No.
Sounds like it could have happened to any of us. It happened to me, not quite like that. I never took naps, not at least at my desk. And I never went to the swing set or playground during my breaks. But yeah, I've had conversations like that. I've been in situations where I was Penny and my boss told me about things that he thought happened with my performance that just simply weren't the case, at least from my point of view. And so right now, I'd like to try something with you. And I'm not sure if you've, in your Zoom experiences, have tried the whole breakout room thing, but this is actually going to be an opportunity for us here to go ahead and to learn with each other from each other. And so I'm going to break you into small groups here. You're going to get an invite in just a moment to join one of these breakout rooms. It's a chance for us to get to know each other a little bit more and talk about the following question. I wish feedback was more. More what? Based on that conversation of Penny and her boss, based on your own experiences in the workplace, either experiences you've had receiving feedback, maybe experiences you've had giving feedback. What do you feel is lacking in feedback? Knowing all the things that are going on deep inside the human mind, knowing how feedback is read by people, how's that going to happen? So I'm going to break you out into these rooms. I'm going to pull you back after just a couple of minutes. Go ahead and introduce yourselves if you don't already know each other. Maybe say where you work, what your function is, and then I wish feedback was more. Okay, here we go. You will be assigned to a breakout room now, and in just a few moments, we'll be pulling all back together.
Okay, everybody, welcome back. And I hope that was an opportunity for you to get to know each other a little bit, interact with each other a little bit, and have a chance to ask yourselves the question, I wish feedback was more. In the reality, I think we all wish feedback was a little bit more. And that's the reason why it's time for us to think about a different kind of approach to giving feedback, not one that is focused on a past that we can't change, but instead that is focused more focused on a future that we can. It's time to stop thinking about feedback, at least the way we think of it traditionally, and to embrace something that I call feedforward. Feedforward is a strengths-based, future-focused kind of feedback that brings out people's best, that focuses on strengths, that keeps them alert, that keeps them aware,
and that ultimately gives them the most clear picture of not just who they are, but who they are becoming. Because ultimately, feedback is a story. And the story that we tell others is not just a story of the past, it's a story of the future, if we let it. And so now in part 2 of our training today, I hope that we'll shift from past to future tense and to think about how we can develop different kinds of conversations that allow for more agency, more authenticity, and I hope more accountability. As you think about these different elements that we're going to be describing, you can actually jot some of your questions down using Slido, that same app that you had opened before, slido.com/65065. And over there, you'll see a tab on the top of your phone or your device to enter into a Q&A. And we'll be leaving time at the end of today's learning to address some of the questions that come in right now, as well as some of the questions or concerns that some of you shared with me before our training today. So be sure to keep your phones nearby and jot down those questions as they roll in. So if feedback is broken, then I think we need to fix it. And to do that, I propose a repair model, because if something's broken, you got to fix it. And in the feedback fix, I tried to do exactly that, is unwind the science and the strategies of feedforward, of the strengths-based future-forward approach to feedback. First described by Marshall Goldsmith as sort of an icebreaker to learn a lot about people in a very short amount of time. But with Marshall's blessing and support, I attempted to unpack all that science and all those strategies and present a very clear and workable model that allows every leader, regardless of where they are in their trajectory, in their leadership path, to develop a more coherent, collaborative approach to giving feedback. So let's start unpacking it. The first part of repair is expands. And for this, big props go out to Zach. who brought us together here in the first place. And as well, a big thank you to Catherine for dealing with all the logistics and helping set us up for today. So my gratitude to both of you guys. And Zach pointed out to me that in the feedback fix, this was the story that he found most captivating, and it has to do with wafers. What do wafers have to do with anything? Well, turns out a lot. There's a school in Israel known as a Ramah school. Seems like an ordinary school, just like any other place that middle schoolers would go, except this was a little bit of a different school. This school was a school for talented and gifted students who, according to the Ministry of Education, were able to place out of their typical classes once a week and go to this special school where the classes that they had were anything but typical. The teachers were not even trained teachers. Some were NASA engineers, others were marine biologists, someone worked in theater, others were culinary experts. And this sort of motley crew of teachers were tasked with creating really challenging and interesting kind of work that would engage these students in their one day off from school. There's one particular teacher at the Ramah School. His name is Elad Segev. Elad Segev is probably one of the smartest people you'll ever meet, with advanced degrees in physics and trained at some of the best universities in the world. Segev is actually spending most of his time finding cures for cystic fibrosis. So he's a pretty awesome guy. In his spare time, he teaches at Ramah. And one day it dawned on him that the students, they just weren't very engaged. Now, granted, they were doing a lot of good work. These were high achievers, after all. But a lot of the students just approached their learning, approached their work as a series of tasks to be accomplished. Throw one at me, I swat it down. And at that point, he felt like this wasn't really something that was actually generating a lot of interest among the students. So here's what he did. Segev decided that one day he was going to mix things up a little bit. So he went home, he grabbed a pack of wafers, some clay, some frosting, and some sprinkles. And he came into class that day and he told his students, here's what you're going to do today. Build a structure that protects your wafers after you frost them from my sprinkles. So go ahead, use all the materials that you have at your disposal, and in a very specific amount of time, I think it was 5 minutes, come up with a structure using your materials, so your modeling clay, some popsicle sticks or toothpicks, and make sure you frost your wafers really well, because I'm coming around with my sprinkles, and when I do, I want to make sure that your structure protects them. Well, this being high-achieving kids, they did exactly that. And they went and they built very beautiful, effective, efficient structures that did exactly as they were told. They protected the frosty wafers from the sprinkles. To be expected. Then there was a second group. Being a scientist, Segev knew he had to have a control. So he brought in another group, and this time, same materials, but very different instructions. Segev told his students, go ahead and protect your wafer from my sprinkles. Again, frost them. I'm going to come around with sprinkles, but just protect those wafers. No limitations of time, no limitations of materials. Do you know what happened? The students, again, succeeded in the task, but the results were so original. Some students used their hands to cup over the wafer so that the sprinkles couldn't fall down. Others took the wafers off the table. Some put it in their pockets. Others ate the wafer. Pretty smart. In each case, though, the response was original and was different. It still achieved the task. But what accounted for the difference? And Segev later began to understand that the difference wasn't in the students, because these were all high achievers. The difference wasn't in the materials. They all had same access. The difference was in the wording. When Segev gave prescriptive directions, he got a uniform response. Build a structure. Use the materials. Do it in this amount of time. But with more open-ended language, he had more creative solutions. The students, on their own, unleashed the creativity, the agency that resided within. And this is a big lesson for us when we give feedback, even in a setting that's totally different than schools. Most of us here realize that we have something to offer, that we have some creativity inside of us. And I bet we recognize that in our team as well. But we have to reach for it. And the way we do that is with a sudden, subtle shift in how we speak to people. Instead of a yeah, but, which closes down thinking, reach for a yes, and. I think we can learn a lot from the world of improv over here. This is what all improvisational comedians understand. It's one of the first rules of improv. Reach for a yes, and. Make your partner look good. Don't shut ideas down in the moment. Keep them rolling. Keep them reaching. Two small words, but a world of difference. When you focus your feedback on yeah, but, when you look only at problems instead of thinking about potential, when all you see is barriers instead of unleashing breakthroughs, when you shrink ideas instead of making them bigger, you lead to dead ends, not on-ramps. And this shift in attitude, this shift in mindset, is one of the underlying assumptions of Feedforward, that it isn't simply about what we see right in front of us right now, but what might still be seen, what's hiding right around the corner. But to do that, we need to think in yes and terms, not yeah, but. That's as far as agency goes in creating more creative possibilities for your teams. And maybe you're thinking if that's a good idea, maybe it raises some questions for you. And again, if you have any on that particular aspect of Feedforward, go ahead and jot it down in our Q&A. By the way, you can upvote different questions. So if you see a question there that you like or was on your mind, you can upvote that and make sure that it gets to the top of our priorities during our Q&A section. But the reality is that most of the time, feedback isn't focused on unleashing someone's creativity. Most people, even for creatives, have to confront the reality that oftentimes it's about the everyday rhythm and rigors of work and how to have those conversations about things that sometimes might not be going so well. Here's where we get to the meat of the repair process, giving feedback that bolsters a sense of authenticity, that helps people really know where we stand so that they know where they stand. Now, in these very challenging and uncertain times, so much has changed, but one thing has not, and that is most managers are very uncomfortable with giving feedback. You probably know this, having received a lot of feedback yourself. The science backs it up. As much as we don't like getting feedback, remember, this is your brain on feedback earlier. Remember feedback chimps? Hands over your eyes, over your mouth, dread, fear, anxiety, stress, judgment. That's as much as managers don't like giving it as well. Because most managers, unless they're really terrible people, don't want to hurt feelings, don't want to rock the boat. And so they do what a lot of people do and opt for a praise sandwich. You know what I'm talking about. Compliment, criticism, compliment. Praise sandwiches, your go-to approach for giving feedback. I've definitely been guilty of giving those in the past. How about you guys? Show virtual hands, either using your actual hands or raised hand feature. Yeah. Yep. It's a trusty, high carb, low protein approach to giving feedback. But the reality is that it's comfortable. We feel like by tucking in that criticism, maybe people won't really know what we're talking about. Maybe they won't really pay attention to this, which is the meat of the sandwich. And just to be clear with you, I have no problem with praise. I think praise plays an important part in motivating people's performance. I like being praised. I think most people do, but it has to be the right kind of praise that's focused on process and not just product, how we went about doing things, not just what we did. The problem with the praise sandwich isn't the praise, it's the sandwich. Do you know what most people hear when they get a feedback sandwich like this? That. The compliments on either end of the sandwich. According to psychology, there's a phenomenon known as the recency effect. Basically just means that we remember the thing that we most recently heard. So if the thing that you heard at the end of that feedback encounter was a compliment, you are very likely going to think just that. Let me give a concrete example. Okay. I just had this conversation with a sales leader who's now dealing with obviously a brave new world of running sales meetings online. And he shared with me a concern he had about one of his sales reps, Mike. The concern he had about Mike, who's a very good salesman, does very well, is that he is very inappropriate in these Zoom team meetings. He looks distracted or agitated. He interrupts people, and it's causing a lot of concern among the team. Like, people are getting awkward. You can tell the meetings are not as productive. And he was asking about what might be able to change that dynamic. I said, we have to overcome that praise sandwich with something else, a feedback wrap. Now, praise sandwiches, they're focused on high carb, low protein diets. Feedback wraps, different story. Here's what it stands for. Okay, when you give a feedback wrap, it stands for what and where, reason, affect, and prompt. You are focusing very specifically on events that have taken place. You are sharing them candidly in real time with a sense of caring. You are moving it out of the realm of judgment and into the realm of observation. And you're introducing a partnership approach. So using this guy, Mike, as an example, let's see if we can go ahead and dig into this feedback wrap approach a little bit and see how, as a method of feed forward, it can be used to drive more authentic conversations with our team. So first, W, what and where. So remember, this is your brain on feedback, that sense of stress, sense of unknowing, not really feeling like you're in control. Your guard is up, your defenses are triggered, you're ready to fight or flight or freeze. One way to address the fight or flight freeze syndrome is to give it an address. Talk about specifically what is happening and where it's happening. So instead of, can I give you some feedback? The opening should be something like, hey, Mike, can we talk about what happened earlier today in our Zoom meeting? Now, there are other things that go into having an appropriate conversation, setting the stage for success. We can talk about those a little bit later and have resources to share with you about all of this. And I'll tell you how to access those at the very end. But by giving your feedback a name and an address, telling Mike exactly what you want to talk about and where it's happening, all of a sudden, that tension goes way down. Not saying it goes away, because it doesn't. There's no magic cure for that feeling of anxiety that creeps over us whenever we hear feedback. But this helps, because now we know it's not about his timeliness, not about his reports. It's not about him going to the playground during lunch or taking naps at his desk, like Penny. Instead, it's very clearly focused on what's happening during the meeting. So you might start by saying, hey, Mike, let's talk about in the meeting, or, when you're having a conversation, can we talk about what happened earlier in the meeting? Because, I felt there were a couple times when Kim was trying to make a point, talk about her pipeline, and you were cutting her off. And then Jim was going over some of his recent numbers, and it looked like you were totally spaced out. Or maybe you were doing something else on your screen. I don't really know, but I didn't get the sense that you were with us. What's happening? Where it's happening. Now Mike knows exactly what's going on. The next part of the wrap is reason. Why does this matter? Why are you taking the time to tell Mike about this? Now you may think to yourself, hang on a second, Joe. We're dealing with adults. Isn't it going to sound infantilizing or like condescending if I tell Mike, the reason I want to have this feedback conversation with you is because, it's really disrespectful to cut off your teammates. And, it really isn't great. It isn't really great, team behavior to zone out when we're trying to run our meetings. That's ridiculous. And I agree, it is. But here's the truth. Most of us are painfully unaware of how we show up to other people. Recent studies have shown that it's as much as 90% of people, which definitely includes me a lot of the time, and may even include you, are not aware of how they show up in these everyday conversations, in these everyday work experiences. And so by telling Mike the reason for why you want to have the conversation, Mike, I want to talk about what's happening, where it's happening, and here's why. Because, as you know, we're going through a very tough time right now as a business, and we have to pull together as a team. And that kind of behavior, I'm sure it's not intentional, but it definitely is having a negative effect. And I saw it in the meeting, and you give examples. what's happening, where it's happening, and why it rises to your level of concern. Now, up until now, the first two parts of the wrap may even be part of your go-to feedback approach already. And if it is, that's great. Being specific and being clear, it's very important. But here's where the wrap takes a turn. It's the second half of that part of that model that makes all the difference. The next is affect. Now, here's a universal truth. People can argue with what we say, but they can't argue with how it makes us feel. Because at the end of the day, I own my own emotions. And you can't tell me they're right or wrong. You can tell me they may not be appropriate for a particular time, but every emotion is right for the right time. May not be the right time, but ultimately, I own that opportunity and that choice. So when feedback becomes a series of you statements, Mike, you interrupted Kim. Mike, you look distracted. Mike, you look tuned out. That feedback response of fight or flight or freeze, it just got reactivated. The threat response just got triggered. You are right back to where you started. But when you move the conversation out of judgment and into the realm of observation, of emotion, then it's a different story. Changing from you statements to I statements makes a world of difference. Listen, Mike, when I observed you interrupt Kim, I felt really bad for her because, I definitely wanted to hear what she had to say. I know that, she was really good about it. She kind of let it go, but I felt bad because that was something that I really wish we could have heard. Or, Mike, I feel like when you're not totally present in the meetings, it not only does it kind of take the mood down, but I recognize you have a lot of great ideas to share, and I'm really hoping you can share those with us. And so making the shift from judgment to observation, from describing how others made you feel, describing what others did to how others made you feel makes a big difference too. But here's the real clincher, and here's what sets the wrap apart from the praise sandwich, and that's prompt. Most of the time, feedback is a series of prescriptions that come directly from the feedback giver, right? Has that ever been your experience? Virtual hands, actual hands, right? Where you're in a feedback conversation and all of a sudden you're getting a series of like, yeah, you should have done this, and here's what I want you to do different next time, and here's how it's going to go, and here's what has to happen. It's great. But I have a question for you. Who's closest to that action? The person giving you feedback or you? The answer, of course, is us. We're the ones who hold the knowledge. We're the ones who just need a little help getting there. And so by ending the conversation with a prompt for future action, not a prescription, but a prompt, something that is generated by the person getting feedback, changes the whole dynamic. Mike, once I've told you about what's going on, where it's happening, why I think it matters, and the feelings it's caused, it's like, what do you think? So one of two things is going to happen. Either Mike will totally double down, get defensive, and reject everything you've just said. It's a possibility. There are people who, like I said, are so unaware of how they're showing up that despite this very concrete, candid, caring approach, will still blow you off. And there's no way to fix that. Okay? Marshall Goldsmith likes to say, how do you give feedback to someone who doesn't want to get it? You don't, because you can't give feedback to someone who doesn't want to hear it. However, when you frame it this way, the more likely response is going to be, I actually didn't think about that. I actually had no idea. I can't believe that happened. Remember the feedback chimps? Before, they were going like this and this because they were afraid of what they were going to hear. Now, you've given someone a better understanding of what's going on, and now maybe they're realizing, oh my God, I did that? That was me? And they see themselves a little bit different now as a result of that conversation. What and where, reason, affect, and prompt. When you give a wrap instead of a praise sandwich, you change the whole dynamic of these conversations. You start to help people begin to see the picture much more clearly. You de-escalate the tension. You don't take it away, but you take it down a few levels. You focus on affect rather than judgment. You give very clear examples rather than beating around the bush. And ultimately, you help people do something with this information by putting the next steps back in their court for them to see the path more clearly so that they can decide what has to happen and what has to happen next. Back to Slido. If you have any questions or comments or concerns, go ahead and use that feature. We'll be checking in a little bit later on with that Q&A. And again, if you have any questions or concerns, things that you wonder about, go ahead and drop your question there. But right now, I'd like to get a little more conversation going with everybody here and ask you about the following. When you think about this feedback wrap approach, I'm curious how you might go ahead and use it. So I'm opening up the chat feature over here. You have the chat feature as well on your end. And I'd love for you to chime in with just a thought or two about where do you see yourself using this information? Where would you put wraps to use? So I'll start in. So where do you see yourself using this wrap approach? In your conversations with your team, maybe with people who report to you, maybe with family, maybe friends? Don't be shy, don't be bashful. And if you're a little bit new to the Zoom experience, there is an icon just by your name. Should be an option for chat, and just activate that chat. And I'd love to hear from you and see what's going on in your mind. What are you thinking? Where are you going to use this? Where might this be helpful to you in your work? I love Danielle's point about getting valuable feedback as well, because when you give that feedback with a wrap approach, it's going to generate a two-way exchange. We're going to talk about that in just a little bit. Thanks, Danielle, for the comment. Preston points out that, yeah, this is definitely worthwhile in a context of friends and peers. It's not just a work thing. Like we said at the start, feedback is a human enterprise. It affects every aspect of our lives, from giving ratings on Amazon to tipping the barista at Starbucks to deciding whether or not to award stars to our Uber driver or leave a virtual tip. This happens all the time. Catherine also sees it as a way to manage up. That's something that definitely was a point of curiosity before we started our training. I got a couple of great pieces of feedback from some of you about how can I use this to manage up for my boss, and I hope we'll talk about that at the very end of Q&A. Yeah, definitely people who are new to the scene, like Nicole's working with an intern, trying to figure out, how can I help this person really kind of get the job done, but also not like destroy the person in the process and give soul-crushing feedback. Okay. Creston makes a great point that it's not just within your own teams, it's really something that focuses outward, client-facing, and especially for creatives, and we have a number of you here today who have to deal with very rapid cycle feedback conversations. This is definitely something that can work in terms of iterating quickly, but also very productively. So thanks very much for chatting in there. I think that was great. And that is the second big impact area of Feedforward, authenticity. So in this section, the fix, we've talked about two things so far. We've talked about agency with the yes and approach, and we've also talked about how to create greater authenticity, some candor, but also caring and collaboration with the wrap model. The reality is that even though this is a great approach for helping people focus on seeing themselves a little bit differently, it also has to bring in to the conversation accountability. Because ultimately, it's not just about how we help people see their work right now, it's how we measure their progress over time and communicate that to them. So how do we reframe this conversation in a way that allows them to see themselves and their work more clearly? If there's anything that I want you to walk away with today, it's this idea. And that is that when it comes to giving Feedforward, we are changing the way people see themselves. And when the conversation turns to accountability, and it has to, because ultimately feedback is about driving results and in creating improvement, then it's more important and more durable to help people become accountable for themselves rather than you owning the process of accountability all by yourself. And to do that, it's going to take a shift. It's going to take a shift in the way you see people to become what I call a mirror holder instead of a window gazer. And take a look at these people over here. So you're standing beside, I mean, I wish we were there right now and not, social distancing and sheltering in place, but if you have this view outside your house, fantastic. Or if you create a virtual backdrop for yourself to view yourself skiing in Colorado or maybe taking a trip abroad, then hey, more power to you. But when you stare out the window with someone and you describe events, it's very likely that you and they are going to end up with two different pictures. And that's okay. I can see it one way, you can see it the other way. The problem is when there's an imbalance of power. And that often is the case when it comes to these performance conversations. One person's in charge, one person's not. One person gets to do the gazing, one person has to hear about what is being seen. And that doesn't lead to partnership. But you know what does? Mirror holding. Because when I hold up a mirror to you, there's still just one view, but it doesn't belong to me. It belongs to you, the person on the other side of that mirror, the person on the other side of that conversation. It's my job as your leader to help you see yourself much more clearly. And to do that, the approach that I think helps people create greater accountability for themselves is a technique that I call the Feedforward interview. And it works with existing performance management measures. It fits into your everyday appraisal system. And it's the focus of a course that I give that we can talk about a little bit later if you'd like, the language of leadership and how to create communication standards and practices throughout your organization for lasting impact. This Feedforward interview is really all about a journey because performance is about a journey. Remember those beautiful mountains that people were looking at first? Well, let's use that as our backdrop and think about stages in this conversation: summit, the peak, trek, the journey, and climb, the ascent. And these are three particular stages of the Feedforward interview that help frame out for people what they see and maybe what they don't see. Let's start with the summit. So when you're having this conversation, and maybe, let's go back to Mike from before. Hopefully he's fixed everything up and is a better participant in his virtual sales meetings with his team as a result of a Feedforward wrap. But now it's, coming up on review time and you want to have these conversations with Mike. And we talked about how difficult it is to recreate the past, the forgetting curve. So instead of focusing on things that maybe were weaknesses, that weren't great, that neither you nor the other person really understand or remember, why don't you focus on the things that stand out, the strengths, the opportunities that made a difference, not only for the person getting feedback, but for everybody as well. So you say, Mike, tell me about a time, this last project, this last quarter, whenever, that you felt like you did something amazing when you were at your personal best. And I guarantee you Mike will remember, because we always remember the highs. We also remember the lows, but we rarely forget those highs. And so Mike will think for a moment and he'll talk about, well, you know what? I remember the way I pitched that client and it looked like a dead lead, but I opened things up. Maybe I used this wrap approach and I did more prompting and less prescribing, but that was really awesome for me. Summit. So then you want to trek alongside Mike. Again, your job is the mirror holder. You got to hold that mirror up to Mike and ask him, Mike, who or what made this possible for you? Because we rarely succeed all by ourselves, and there's always somebody by our side helping us get there. So who was it for you, Mike? Who were the people? Maybe it was me, maybe it was other members of your team. What were the conditions that allowed you to feel this level of success? How did you land that client after struggling for so long? And he'll start to retrace steps and you'll start to ask. And this coach approach to giving feedback, where you as the feedback giver are acting more as a coach, less as a judge, makes a huge difference in becoming this mirror holder that we're talking about. And this is all part of that course of the language of leadership, how to develop that coach approach, whether you're just starting out as a leader or whether you're seasoned, but you feel like you could be doing even more in your work in this regard. And once you've identified this moment of peak and you've trekked, with the other person on what was great and who helped to make that possible, you come to the final step. Because doing something once, that's a moment, but doing it again and again, that's a habit. And what we want in our work is habits. And this is the part where you create the accountability with the person instead of for the person. Mike, so wow, that was an amazing moment, how you landed that client. You talked about how Kim and Jim were helping you along with that, and how the fact that I kind of backed off a little bit gave you the breathing room to do that. So, what would it take for this to happen again? And he'll start going through that process with you. Not only is Mike going to make it clear for himself what has to happen next and identify the things that really make a difference in his performance, but you, as the person giving feedback, as the mentor, director, boss, you're going to have new information that you might not have had before. You're going to hear pieces of Mike's story that you didn't know, or maybe didn't know that well, and it can help you plan your next steps too. Summit, trek, climb. Accountability isn't what we do to people. It's what we do for people. And by thinking alongside them as a mirror holder, helping them think in plural, helping them think about the people who helped them get there, helping them see themselves as part of the story, and helping them understand their strengths rather than their weaknesses, helps build this accountability into standard measures of appraisal that definitely have a place, even in a feed-forward system, in terms of decisions around comp and promotion and project assignments. But it's not just a softer way to go about accountability, it's a more impactful way too. It helps people see the picture more clearly. It helps you see the picture more clearly too. So today, to bring this all together, we talked about two different aspects, the past and the future. We talked about feedback fails. This is your brain on feedback, the toxic stress, the feeling of judgment, of bias that creeps into these conversations whenever we tell people what we think is going on in the way that we see it, using language that is very narrow, very prescriptive, focusing on a past they can't change, describing events they can't control, and ultimately being part of a picture that we can't even really remember all that well the longer the time from the moment that events happen to the moment that they are discussed. But there's a better way, feed forward, a feedback fix that focuses on repair, repairing not only our conversations, but our human relationships, about thinking about the whole process of performance differently, not just ratings and metrics, but strengths and development, seeing ourselves not just as judges of people's work, but as coaches who help them do better work, giving wraps instead of sandwiches, using interviews to help people track that moment of success, the people who made it possible, and the way they can do it all again. When you think about this, it does sound like a lot. And it definitely should represent a sea change in the way that we think about performance, the way we approach these conversations. So my best advice to everyone here is start small. Think about this not as one leap into feed forward, but small steps, things you can do right now, whether it's changing the way you have the conversations to create more agency, having more authentic conversations with wraps instead of sandwiches, or creating accountability that really resonates for people because it's something that they own for themselves. Choosing your entry point is the best way to start, because if we're brave enough and bold enough to think about feedback differently, then we're not only going to make a difference in the organizations that we serve or the products that we sell, we're going to change the way we relate to the people we support.